What's up, folks? Welcome back to TacticalTortoise. My name is Trevi, and we're still continuing our coverage of the April 2024 Munitorum Field Manual, a points update to every faction in Warhammer 40k. In my last video, we talked about the factions that were the most improved by these points changes, and today we're going to be talking about the opposite, the factions that were the most nerfed. Now, one thing I want to point out before we jump into it is how, I want to say, even-handed the points changes were in this update. We didn't really see the paradigm that we've seen in the past, where factions that are overperforming get punched into the ground with the fist of an angry god by massive points cuts across the board. Instead, we saw very targeted nerfs to specific units that were problematic, but in most cases, factions also got buffs elsewhere. So while on the whole the factions we're talking about are going to be less powerful overall, they will still have some cheaper tools to play with. And personally, I think that's really cool. You can call me a GW shill in the comment section all you want, but I'm going to point out reasonable game design when I see it. Not true line of sight, though. That can go f itself. Now, first, for some honorable mentions. Imperial Knights actually saw no changes in their entry at all, which is a little surprising because the faction was underperforming leading into this season, and will, I think, likely continue to do so. Many Imperial Knights lists lent heavily on Agents of the Imperium to shore up their scoring deficiencies. Imperial Knights have a little bit of trouble with tactical secondaries because they are a low model count army. When you're only bringing 6 or 7 models to the table, being able to go perform actions and get into particular areas of the table in order to score is sometimes a little bit tough. So they relied on units like the Calidus Assassin, Inquisitorial Henchman, for example, in order to perform those actions. And both of those units have increased in value, meaning that Imperial Knights are going to see a slight increase to many of their lists just based on those allies alone. Although, shout out to all the people in my comments who are very proud of the fact they play Imperial Knights with no allies, because your lists haven't changed. Congratulations. Space Marines also deserve a mention in this section, which I know is funny because I talked about them in the previous video about how they have been improved, but they are also seeing nerfs to very specific sub-factions. Blood Angels and Black Templars in particular saw massive points increases on many of their specialized units, but Blood Angels did see some points cost reductions on units like Sanguinary Guard, which I think are going to be eminently playable moving on into this season. It seems like Blood Angels are still going to see play moving forward. Black Templars I'm probably a little bit more curious of because they did get hammered by additional points changes, and changes to the Ironstorm Spearhead detachment that Black Templars usually relied on are also going to hurt the faction as well. So that chapter specifically may fall off a little bit, but hopefully we will see some other chapters improve. Now let's move into factions that did get nerfed. Grey Knights saw changes to useful utility units like Librarians and Tech Marines. Librarians were incredibly strong for jumping in out of Deep Strike, performing actions, and still dealing damage with their Vortex of Dooms. And we saw an expected nerf to the Dread Knight. I have an entire video about how insane Dread Knights are that I released last week. Those guys are going up a little bit in points, but notably, the Grand Master Nemesis Dread Knight, the character version of the datasheet, did not see any changes whatsoever. So maximum Dread Knight lists are going to see some relatively significant points increases, but lists that were only relying on the character variety are actually not going to be changed much at all. That said, the faction did see many discounts to medium infantry. Units like Strike Squads, Inceptors, and Purgators were all discounted slightly, which means that more infantry-focused varieties of Grey Knights might be more playable in the future. Astra Militarum is the next one on the list. This one is probably more like a side grade, but it will hurt the faction overall. While they did see points breaks to many incredibly useful units. Units like Rough Riders, Leman Russ, and Tempestus Scions, which I have a whole video about how insane they are as well, and a list based entirely around Adepta Scions that dropped tons of points in this update. Those all got points discounts. However, most of the most highly played units in the Codex were massively increased. Units like the Manticore, Bulgrin Squads, and Kazarkin were played in 2s or 3s in most Astra Militarum armies, and this is basically going to require that Militarum players retool their lists. If they still want to rely on those tools, they are going to have to take significantly less of them in order to fill out a list. That's a huge paradigm shift for the faction that basically relied on 3 or 4 data sheets being buffed by their orders, Lord Soror Leonte Countess and their stratagems. However, they're probably going to have to diversify the portfolio a little bit moving forward, which is going to be fairly painful. Adepta Sororitas also saw some similar changes. They got points off some of their useful units. Some of the pain engines, like Mortifiers and Penitent engines, got a discount. Those units are seen play, oftentimes in singletons, so that they can be killed to generate miracle dice, but also are good at fighting enemy utility units. However, huge hits to Arcoflagellants, Crusaders, and the Blade of St. Eleanor enhancement are all going to hurt the faction quite a bit. Overall, I think Adepta Sororitas, while they may recoup 10 to 20 points based on the units that reduced in cost, they will likely lose a lot more than that, given that most lists were running 3+ Arcoflagellant units. Aeldari also saw similar changes. They got some points cuts on units like Guardian Defenders, Storm Guardians, Striking Scorpions, and Howling Banshees, but those units aren't really seeing very much play, and so how much that will affect Aeldari list building has yet to be seen. However, many Aeldari staples, characters like Fuegan, units like D-Cannon support weapon platforms, as well as utility like Shadow Specters and Swooping Hawks all went up. And the Phoenix Gem, an enhancement that was taken in most Eldar lists to protect their Autarch Warlord, also went up as well, meaning that Aeldari are going to be the recipients of yet another nerf, bringing the faction's power level down slightly. Now, I don't think this is going to be a huge hit to the faction, although, unlike many other factions, I don't think that they are going to be able to fall back on swapping into units that did get discounts, because those units don't really overlap quite as well with the utility units that did get their points cost increased. Now, moving into this data slate update, there was a huge elephant in the room, a big skeleton mechanical elephant, that being Necrons. Necrons were kind of arguably the best performing faction in the previous season. They weren't consistently winning, but they were winning fairly commonly, and they had a wide variety of list archetypes within their faction that they could rely on to do fairly well in the competitive scene. Unfortunately for them, they flew a little too close to the sun, and its warming rays melted their wings, and they've plummeted down to the Earth to be impacted by massive points hikes to units like Catan Shards, as well as their Cryptex, as well as some smaller adjustments to staples in the Hypercrypt Legion detachment, like the Monolith Immortals and the Enhancement Dimensional Overseer, which kind of surprises me, to be honest. Dimensional Overseer was always kind of a little bonus that you got, and this leaves the detachment with no 10-point enhancements, so you don't have any of those nice points filler enhancements that you can use to fill points if you have any left at the end of your list building process, which feels, I don't know, like a little twist of the knife for Necron players. The change to Immortals too is also surprising, since they are mostly useful for their interaction with Cryptex attaching to them, and with the Cryptex mostly universally getting points cost increased, the Immortals themselves are naturally going to cost more points for the whole brick. So why we're increasing the points cost of the Immortals and the Cryptex also is a little surprising. Technomancers were the biggest hit here. They went up a staggering 25 points. However, that was due to their synergy with Canoptech Wraiths. Now, Canoptech Wraiths, importantly, did not see any changes. This was a unit that was much complained about. They're fast, incredibly difficult to kill with a bunch of wounds, a 4+ invulnerable save, and with the Technomancer attached, a 5+ feel no pain, and have reasonable damage output as well. It was expected that that unit would probably get hit, but it sounds like they've just rolled nerfs of the Wraiths into the Technomancer himself, and so he's basically paying for the sins of the Wraith unit that he's attaching into. Overall, that means that units focused on Wraiths are only going up a few points, having to pay for their attached Technomancers, and you may see them without Technomancers, especially in 3-man units, just to act as a relatively resilient utility unit that can fight enemies over objectives. The biggest loss to Necrons here, in my opinion, are the Catan Shards. Now, to be fair, I think everyone saw this coming. Catan Shards were ubiquitous in basically every Necron list, and in many matchups were nigh unkillable and also able to do massive damage. While they weren't particularly fast, detachments like Hypercrypt Legion allowed you to teleport them around the table and get them up close to your opponent very quickly, and since most armies in the game couldn't kill them reliably, you were able to teleport them in front of your opponent's army and then move them into melee on the subsequent turn. Altogether, these changes are disastrous for the Hypercrypt Legion in particular, and it may be that we are going to be seeing Necrons move to other detachments like Awakened Dynasty or Canoptech Court, focusing on those not debuffed Wraiths in their competitive builds. Now, that said, those builds are fairly good, and I think could have stood to lose a couple of points and still remain fairly competitive, so those lists in particular are probably still going to see play but I doubt that we will see Hypercrypt Legion super often. But it feels like the internal balance of each detachment is thrown off slightly. Now, it's not all bad for Necrons. As I said at the top of the video, most factions got some points decreases to go alongside their points debuffs, and we did see useful utility units like Ophidian Destroyers, Deathmarks, and Flayed Ones all go down. Those are definitely useful, and all those units are eminently playable and see competitive play fairly often, as well as Scorpic Destroyer bricks. The Scorpic Destroyers and Scorpic Lords have dropped, meaning that Annihilation Legion actually got significantly cheaper, but that detachment isn't good. I don't know how often those units are going to see play. That's probably small solace to the Necron players out there, but it is something, I guess. And with that, those are the most nerfed factions in the game after this April data slate. Let me know down in the comment section what you think about these changes and if you disagree with any of the factions that have been nerfed in this way. Thanks for watching all the way to the end of the video. Thanks as well to everyone who supports the channel, either over on Patreon at patreon.com/TacticalTortoise, YouTube channel members, and Twitch subscribers. All you people are amazing, and I love you. Remember to keep it classy, folks, and have happy wargaming.